In the history of maritime disasters, the one ship that everyone has heard of is the Titanic. The pride of her company, the White Star Line, and the biggest ship in the world. Her tragic loss on her maiden voyage in 1912 shook the world. That a ship some had claimed unsinkable could be so cruelly destroyed, and with such tremendous loss of life. It was designed and built as the safest and most luxurious liner on the lucrative North Atlantic passenger route. The Cunard liners, Lusitania and Mauretania, had been built for speed, but the White Star's new giant liners, Olympic and Titanic, were the last word in elegance, comfort and safety, and the pinnacle of Edwardian marine technology. New theories are still being debated, whether inferior steel was used in her construction, whether a fire in her coal store urged the captain to maintain a dangerously high speed in an ice field with definite warnings of icebergs. But even at the time, the facts of what really happened were not immediately clear. What is clear is that the great ship, built by Harland and Wolff in Belfast, along with her sister ship Olympic, set sail from Southampton on April the 10th, 1912. She called at Cherbourg and Queenstown in Southern Ireland before setting off towards New York. At 20 minutes to midnight on April the 14th, she struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic. Just over 2.5 hours later, she had gone down. Only 705 people survived from the 2,228 on board. The liner carried more than the regulation number of lifeboats, but there were only enough places for about half those on board ship, and she wasn't even full. And with many lifeboats only partially filled, even less people could be saved. At dawn, these survivors were rescued by the liner Carpathia, the first ship on the scene. On both sides of the Atlantic, confusion reigned, particularly in the press. What were the facts? Many newspaper editors had to speculate on what had and what was happening. The Carpathia steamed on towards New York, which looked very different from how it looks today. Captain Rostron only allowed personal messages to be broadcast from the ship, so it wasn't until the Carpathia docked in New York that the press and the world knew the true story of the sinking of the Titanic. The profusion of information in the American press looked at the disaster from all sides, and some of the sidelights featured in the minor headlines carry their own human interest. There was great use of illustrations. Pictures and artwork were suitably evocative and dramatic. There were various graphic ways of comparing sizes of the ship to buildings and the iceberg. The British press also responded quickly.
The newspapers of the time had a field day. The first newspapers in America just tended to report that the ship was safe. Then, as later reports came in, they reported the disaster and its magnitude. The English newspapers didn't. They just said that the ship had been saved and that she was under tow and everybody had survived. This one actually says, "Disaster to the Titanic, world's largest ship collides with an iceberg in the Atlantic." But underneath it does say that everybody was saved and that the ship is being towed. In the later editions it had the full disaster. On Saturday, April the 20th, which was the first Saturday after the disaster, the newspapers, or a lot of them, produced their own special editions. This shows one cover of the Daily Mirror for Saturday, April the 20th. And this is this same newspaper with a different cover. One was the first edition and the other was the second edition. The Daily Graphic, which was a daily newspaper, well, in fact there were two of them. One was an illustrated one which came out on the Saturday only, and this one was the normal daily newspaper. This is a special complete magazine, or complete newspaper rather. There was a commemorative one, whereas the Graphic magazine, which is this one, has a few articles on Titanic, but the rest of it is the normal magazine. This was very much like the Illustrated London News. On April the 27th, which was the following Saturday, they did it yet again. Not so much with the newspapers, but with the magazines. They were bringing out all kinds of more detailed items that they thought that the public would be interested in, which of course they were. Well, we found that when we were doing research for the book, all kinds of little human interest stories, and the favourite one is that the passengers got off the ship with 5 dogs. Believe it or not, they managed to save 5 dogs. I couldn't believe it when I read it. My daughter had asked me some years ago about this, and I said no, there weren't any dogs that survived. And there it was, out of 300,000 words, one paragraph.
Right, okay.
It wasn't only the Graphic that did special editions. This one is of the Sphere for the 20th, but also the Illustrated London News, Lloyd's Weekly News. They put out a superb magazine completely devoted to the Titanic. Very, very good indeed. I think they ended up going to 3 editions within just a few weeks. Very popular.
Then there was a profusion of memorial artifacts, postcards, artwork, sheet music. The style was melodramatic and sentimental, but sincere and of its time. And gradually memorials were commissioned and constructed to the passengers, crew, musicians and so on. One of the largest in the UK is to the ship's engineers, here in Southampton. A statue to Captain Smith was funded by private subscriptions and eventually erected in Lichfield, Staffordshire, a place with no particular link with him or the great ship. And this memorial is in New York City. It's a memorial lighthouse erected in 1913 to the memory of the officers, passengers and crew of the Titanic. This lighthouse stood above the East River on the roof of the old Seamen's Church Institute on South Street. And from 1913 to 1967, the time ball at the top of the lighthouse would drop down the pole to signal 12 noon to the ships in the harbour. This time ball mechanism was activated by a telegraphic signal from the National Observatory in Washington, D.C. In 1968, the lighthouse was moved to its present position as part of the entrance to the South Street Seaport Museum. New York has more memorials to the Titanic than any other city. Then there were the official inquiries, which give us most of our historical evidence of what actually happened on the night of April 14th.
There were two inquiries for the Titanic. The first one was in America, where they subpoenaed nearly all the crew, including Bruce Ismay, who was the chairman of White Star Line, and the senator's report was that he personally was to blame, which was totally wrong. They also said that the ship was going too fast and didn't have enough lifeboats, although she was carrying more than the lifeboats required by the Board of Trade. There was a lot of problems with the detention of the crew in America, and after representations from the British government, most of the crew were allowed to leave except for the officers. Then, as they came back to England, another inquiry was opened. A lot of the crew were temporarily imprisoned for 24 hours in Plymouth. The unions managed to get them away from the Lapland, the ship that was carrying them, and after negotiations, the crew were sent home. The second inquiry was chairmaned by Lord Mersey in London, and their report was basically the same as the Americans. The ship was going too fast, she didn't have enough lookouts, and the captain ended up with the blame, which is, you know, standard. And White Star Line was very heavily censured over the loss of the Titanic. After the sinking, the ships were made to travel much farther south on the ice routes to lower their speed, to have lifeboats for all, and to maintain much better lookouts. In 1991, another government inquiry was instituted because of the finding of the Titanic where Captain Lord said she was. Nobody believed at the time. Captain Lord, who was captain of the Californian, said that the Titanic was 19 miles away from where he was. In fact, when they found her, she was 19.7 miles, so his navigation was spot on. And the family tried to clear his name. So the government instituted another inquiry. The report came out in April of 1992, and the report states that the ship was in the correct place, but because of the unbelievable clarity of the night, Captain Lord's ship did actually see the Titanic's rockets, but also stated that even if he had steamed at full speed, which obviously he couldn't do because he was in the middle of pack ice, he wouldn't have arrived any sooner than the Carpathia.
Many survivors gave evidence at those first inquiries, and then they got on with their lives.
When we got to New York, the people were very good to us, the people in New York. We went to the Junior League overlooking the river. And then they took me over to the shop and bought me a fur coat and a pair of shoes, which I hardly got. And then we went to Seattle, where my father was going to take over a hotel over there. Of course, when Father got drowned, and all that was cancelled, you see. So my mother booked a passage back to South Africa. So we went back to Cape Town.
My father's sister lived in New York, and the plan was that we were going to stay with her for, I think it was 3 or 4 days, and then get the train through to Canada. So of course she met us, and we were whisked straight off to her home. And I was ill. I had, when they threw me from one boat into the other, they bruised me very badly right across, and I had lots of bouts of sickness, so they took me straight away into a hospital to have a look at me. And so I didn't see really much of the furore, actually. And we came back home quite quickly. Now, coming home, my mother went to bed every night and slept. I was the one that was a terror coming home. I wouldn't come out of the cabin. She lured me up onto the deck one day, and that was about all. Well, she came back to her parents, who of course were getting on. She was 50 by then, my mother. And we lived in this small town with my parents. And then I had a great musical talent, I was told. Anyway, I played the piano very well, and I taught. And at 18 I had my voice trained, and I did a lot of professional singing. And she died when I was 23, and I went off to Australia. Well, I went to Singapore to stay with her godson, who invited me to do that. And then I went on to Australia with the idea that I might live there. I wasn't sure. But I did a lot of singing, and even in those days I was singing on the radio in Australia, and that's a long time ago, 1929. And but I didn't like it well enough to want to live there, so I came back to England. And I came back to England, and I had 3 or 4 really bad colds, really bad colds, and I couldn't sing. And I lost a lot of engagements through not being able to go, and I thought, well, perhaps, I came back in the winter, you see, from this very warm climate. So I thought, well, perhaps I'd better do something else. So a friend of mine had a very large wholesale motor business, and so I joined him there and ran the wholesale department. Still did a lot of singing in the evenings and that sort of thing. And then, of course, when the war broke out, like everyone else, it wasn't a question of what I wanted to do. I was a single woman on my own, and I could very easily have been sent up to a munition factory in goodness knows where. So I went to the Ministry of Food, and I was the food officer for this borough, and I hated it. I dislike it. Filling in forms and answering questions, no good to me. So I got out of that and went to work in a factory where they were making not actually munitions, but parts for guns and for what we called bomb slips, the things that the bombs were slipped with, I suppose, out of the aeroplane. And I liked that. It was people, I was working with people. And the director let me join the Industrial Welfare Society and paid for my training. So I became an industrial welfare officer, and that I did to the end of my working days, which I loved because it was dealing with people. In addition to that, I was a magistrate, and I loved that too, because again, it's people. Now I'm so old I have to just sit and talk about it.
And shortly after the war, Walter Lord, researching his book, A Night to Remember, was trying to contact as many survivors as possible.
Eva Hart is a perfectly marvelous person. She was only 7 or 8, but she was extremely wide-eyed and alert, and remembered, I thought, very well particularly the awakening of her getting up, getting dressed, getting life preserver, getting it up on deck, being separated from her father, or when he put them in a boat, I think. And it was, she was just a wonderful source, and she liked talking about it. There were other wonderful sources. Renee Harris was a lady who was on board the Titanic with her husband, who was a theatrical producer. They were in the theater business, and they knew she had a sense of crisis and climax, and she later went into the theater business herself because she lost her husband on board. She got on one of the last lifeboats, in fact, the last lifeboat. And she could see what I was looking for, the vivid things. And she was at the same time a good reporter, and she was on almost to the end. Captain Smith saw her at one point on the bridge when the ship was almost at its beam's end, and he said, "What are you doing still here?" Because he knew her from being a prominent passenger. And she walked from the starboard side to the port side through the bridge. I think she's probably the last passenger to see Captain Smith, because she left only 15 minutes after her lifeboat left, the ship went down. Oh, she was one of the best sources too that I had. Her name was Edith Russell. She was a perfectly wonderful person. She was a fashion stylist, she called herself. Her name was Rosenbaum at the time, and she was Edith Rosenbaum, and she had been to Paris for the spring collections of dresses and fashions and style, and her business was a little bit borderline. She made quick sketches of them, brought them back for New York to the designers, and which she sold them. So she had a sort of running trade back and forth across the Atlantic. She was on board with a separate cabin full of dresses and so on. The one thing she had that was of virtually no value, but which she cherished, was a little music box pig, which was a lucky symbol. She had been in an automobile accident, had survived, and her father gave her this, told her it was a lucky talisman to take it with her wherever she went. Pigs in France bring you luck. Edith Russell was firmly convinced that it brought her luck, and she wouldn't dream of doing anything without the pig being along. So when the Titanic was sinking and she was out on the boat deck waiting to get into the boat, she suddenly realized she didn't have her pig. And she was very hesitant, and her steward came up to her at that time. Stewards being very solicitous people on ships. They'll do anything for you. And this steward proved it by going back to Edith Russell's cabin and getting for her the pig, this pig. And so when he came back, it was wrapped in a blanket. And it was such a big bulging thing that in the half light of lowering the boats, a sailor took it and threw it into the boat and told Edith to follow it. He thought it was a baby. And he said, "There's your baby, follow it." So Edith did follow it, and therefore she claims was saved by the pig. It's a musical pig, and she wound it up and played the Maxis for the children in the lifeboat. But most of the passengers in that boat that I found were just irritated by the pig, rather than thinking it was such a touching detail.
Edith Russell, Edith Rosenbaum then, also kept the telegraphs she sent from the Carpathia. And the slippers that she wore on board the Titanic. William McQuitty, who produced the film version A Night to Remember, was given a purse which had been found by a survivor in one of the lifeboats.
There were some 80 survivors alive when I made this film, and I had 50 letters and contact with 50 of them. Edith Russell came on board the sets from time to time, and so did Lawrence Beasley, and with great help. And one survivor sent me this purse with a letter, and it's a silver purse, and inside there's a 1 cent American piece dated 1912. I received this silver purse from Joe Mulholland. He says, "I met an old shipmate of mine down in the River Plate, South America, in La Plata. When ashore on the booze, his name was Baker, but all his mates called him Pancake. He was one of the crew who was lucky, one of the lucky ones to get away. He told me that the purse was lying in the bow of the lifeboat in which he was fortunate to crawl on board out of the ditch. Inside the purse was a brooch and $20, a ring, signet, 1 cent piece, a silver chain attached to the purse as strap or handle. I asked him what he did with the ring, brooch, and chain, and he told me that he flogged them for booze. I got the purse from him for a drink or two, containing the 1 cent piece. Pancake died in the asylum in Belfast." It's a difficult letter to read because
Bill McQuitty saw the Titanic launched in Belfast as a boy, and he renewed a contact with the ship by having a copy of his autobiography, A Life to Remember, taken down to the wreck in a submersible. And it's got the official stamp to prove it.
this book was taken down by the Russian submarine Mir 2 to the wreck of the Titanic. And this is their certificate to that effect.
Bill McQuitty's film, A Night to Remember, is the finest screen version of the tragedy. And somehow the Titanic and the cinema were made for each other. The spectacular bigness of the whole venture, the blend of classes and characters aboard her, the epitome of elegance and style in design, engineering and lifestyle, and yet the fatal flaws in the design that could not save the so-called unsinkable ship from sinking, and in human judgment to negotiate an ice field at full speed, and to evacuate the liner more effectively with the time given to do it. The ship within sight that didn't come to the rescue. The many human stories of courage, heroism and despair. It was a microcosm of society and the end of an era. And it was a story made for the movies. The only genuine film which exists of the great ship consists of 2 brief shots taken on February the 17th, 1912, as she entered the Thomson graving dock next to Harland and Wolff's yard in Belfast. Within days of the sinking, newsreels were being shown, put together from existing footage of the Titanic's sister ship Olympic, filmed on her maiden arrival in New York in June 1911. And here doubling for the Titanic. This is one surviving newsreel. These scenes were filmed on board the Carpathia within a couple of days of her docking at Pier 54, New York. A number of young stewards from the Carpathia act up for the cameras. In these early days of cinema, these very long, unedited shots, moving photographs really, were very common. Captain Rostron's name is misspelt on more than one newsreel. And then there were the dramatized films.
Well, the first Titanic film was produced in New York in just within a month or so of the disaster, and it was called Saved from the Titanic. And it starred a young lady who had actually been a passenger on board the Titanic, Dorothy Gibson.
The film was planned, written and shot in 3 weeks and released on May the 14th, 1912. No print of this film survives. It was made by Eclair, a French film company. Dorothy Gibson had been saved in lifeboat number 7, which was launched at 12:45 a.m. with only 28 people on board. Here she shows the location of the sinking. And here she wears the same clothes in which she was saved from the Titanic. Here she's greeted by her father and her boyfriend, Ensign Jack. And these are the Eclair Studios in New Jersey.
Following this, there was a German film within a year of the disaster, and then we had to wait until 1929 for the next one, which was a British film, the first all-British talking film called Atlantic. And Atlantic had among the members of its cast a young lady named Madeline Carroll. Atlantic was interesting in another respect. It was shot simultaneously. The same sets were used, and the English version was shot, and then they brought in another set of actors who did it in German.
To make a comparison, here's a particular scene in English and then the same scene in German.
Whatever it is. If anything loomed ahead of interest to us, you would hear 3 bells from the lookout.
Thank you.
No, we're not worried. Now we know where we are. And if you waited for that, you'd probably sit up all night. Good night, all. Good night. Good night. But I'm not going to do that.
Und wenn wirklich was von Interesse gesichtet werden sollte, dann werden Sie von dem Mann im Ausguck 3 Glockenschläge hören. Doch nicht so ängstlich. Und wenn Sie darauf warten wollten, dann könnten Sie die ganze Nacht hier aufbleiben. Nein, wollen wir nicht. Jedenfalls eine gute Nacht.
Close the watertight doors. Close the watertight doors, sir. Draw the flares. Draw the fires. Draw the fires. Draw the fires.
Hauptwitz! Schotten schließen!
Schatten schließen.
Löscht die Feuer unter den Kesseln!
Löscht die Feuer unter den Kesseln.
Löscht die Feuer unter den Kesseln!
Löscht die Feuer unter den Kesseln.
The disaster scenes are excellently achieved.
The German interest in Titanic continues with a propaganda film around 1943 called Titanic. And interestingly enough, some of the footage in the German propaganda film turns up in A Night to Remember. There have been several other films done during the post-war years. But
there have been many films made of Titanic, and this one with Clifton Webb and Barbara Stanwyck and a very young Robert Wagner was made in the 1950s. It was a fair success, but it was nowhere near as successful as the next one, which is A Night to Remember, the very famous one by Walter Lord.
Head and Shoulders Above Them All is the film based on Walter Lord's book, and the same title, A Night to Remember. The film, for its authenticity, for its casting, for the transliteration from the printed page to the screen, has seldom, if ever, been equaled in any other film.
There is always, I think, a difficulty in translating the print medium into visuals. And I think in the case of A Night to Remember, the test of time shows that it was a marvelous, marvelous translation between those two media. You have incredible attention to detail and accuracy, the sets, the costumes, the dialogue, everything is right on the mark. And from a historical standpoint, that's what we look for, something that is true to the original event. A Night to Remember is a significant movie for the reason that it is keeping the modern generation aware of the story of the Titanic. We use the movie very successfully in our English curriculum, and students of a wide variety of ability levels have found it an absolutely enthralling and fascinating experience to learn about the ship and the people who were on board. It has often been said that today's generation of teenagers is completely turned off and tuned out in terms of history. One only has to look at their riveted faces in a classroom showing of A Night to Remember to know that that's not true. The movie brings history alive, and from that standpoint, it is a valuable educational tool. One of the things that never ceases to amaze me, having seen the movie dozens and dozens and dozens of times, is the fact that it continues to move. It continues to touch the heart. You look at the movie, particularly the ending with the strains of Nearer, My God, to Thee, and it continues to clutch at the emotions. And I think really for a movie to withstand that sort of repeated exposure is really a testament to the beautiful job that was done.
I think it stands up very, very well. Particularly the end of the ship. I don't see how they managed to do it so effectively when they were just working with the studios and props. And when the bow goes, the ship goes down under the sea, it just must have been the way it was. I've seen countless accounts of the ship going down, and it was just an enormously impressive performance. I would say I was lucky to have had a film producer, director, screenwriter, who followed so faithfully the facts as I felt I'd put them together. When there was doubt, they would always do what had really happened rather than make up something. I remember Eric Ambler changing several bits of dialogue and to the script to go with what I said. And I was so sure that what I said was right that I didn't appreciate sufficiently that the people who made the film were willing to go along with me, whatever I said.
Walter Lord is the dean of Titanic scholars. In fact, I owe my own interest in the Titanic to having read Walter's book when I was just a young child. So many thousands and thousands of people can claim what I did, that Walter was the one who interested us in Titanic, and we're very grateful to him for that. Without his book, many of us would have been blissfully unaware of the incredible drama that was Titanic. So I think Walter is really the genesis of the modern study of Titanic. It was he who essentially built the first bridge between the coverage of 1912 and the modern day research efforts that are going on.
It's in its 55th paperback printing. Then there are editions all over the world. For a while I collected them all, and I have a dozen or more, and they're fun to keep, and I proudly put them up on the shelf of my bookcase. But it interests me that so many people in so many places have become interested in this subject. The editions are in every language you could possibly think of. Not long ago, somebody sent me 9 copies of the Pakistani edition. Well, I wish I had 9 Pakistani friends, but they just sit on the shelf as it is. The whole subject has become sort of gotten much attention. Bob Ballard is now going to the bottom of the sea and found the ship, and that opens up a whole another can of mysteries. And I get a great deal of mail from all over the world, and interestingly enough, all ages. The letters start coming when children hit about 10 or 12, and if they're precocious and readers at all, they will start reading and they will start asking questions too. And they do that a great deal, and I try to answer them all. Do it a great deal, probably I get half a dozen a month. And considering this has gone on for 30-some years, it adds up.
The ethics of bringing items up from the seabed near the Titanic has caused great and heated discussion. But what this exhibition has done has brought the Titanic tangibly closer to today. Suddenly it all seems very close, very new, very real. The Titanic is one of those subjects that fascinates people. It's full of interest, it's full of intrigue, and it's still very controversial. The story of the Titanic echoes down the decades.